Here's the funny thing is when you begin serving him and you begin to be invited into other positions of leadership, you need him to show up.
Yeah.
Otherwise you're doing all your strength. And that's terrible. We really, I just feel like we need to invite people to be creative again about like finding opportunities, being curious, test it out. If it fails, learn from it, try something different, but have fun finding your space where you can rub shoulders with new people and make disciples.
What's up, guys? This is Jeremy McCommons, your host of Ordinary Discussions. Thanks so much for tuning in. Hey, it's an exciting time in Ordinary Discussions. We're kind of switching gears in the podcast. We'll still do some of the same conversations we had before, but we want to get really focused on what it looks like to be a disciple maker. And we feel like a great way to do that is to interview people that are already doing it in their own lives. So oftentimes this topic of discipleship is very abstract. It's like, how do I do it? What does it look like? I'm an ordinary person. I go to my job, my 9 to 5 every day. I'm busy with the kids in the evenings and the weekends. So how the heck am I supposed to do this thing called discipleship? So we feel like it'd be a great idea to have people on the show or on the podcast that are doing discipleship so that we can hear how God moved in their life, how they said yes to his calling, and how they're walking it out in their lives. So going forward, most of our podcasts are going to be about inspiring you, educating you, and pointing you to how to walk out discipleship in your life. So that brings us to today. We have our great guest. It's Alex Rossie. I'm sure you know his name. He's the director of operations with Ordinary Movement. And this wasn't just an easy guest to get, so we chose Alex. It's because Alex personifies what it looks like to be a disciple maker. He's an ordinary guy. He's had his ups and downs in life. He's had his struggles in his faith. But through that, without a college degree, without a seminary degree, without any formal education in ministry, he has, in my opinion, had as much impact in his life, he's a young guy, in his short life of ministry, of almost anyone I know. And but you wouldn't know about it. You don't read about it. He's the ordinary man out doing discipleship. And so I thought it would be a great guest for today. So thanks so much for tuning in and enjoy this discussion. Let's do this. Hey, Alex, how are you?
I'm doing all right, man. How about you?
Oh, good. This is great to have you on the podcast. I feel like, and I think we will in the future because you're going to start doing some more interviews yourself, but I'd love to hear your voice more. So this is a great opportunity for our audience and those in Ordinary Movement to kind of learn a little more about who you are and where you came from. So I'm excited about this.
Yeah, it's an honor. Thank you for having me on the show, and hopefully I have something to share that will help others, and if nothing else, give them some creative ideas to test out themselves.
Yeah, well, it's great that you're the first guest in this new-ish format of interviewing disciple makers to try to help others that are called to be disciples and make disciples to take this very abstract thing and make it more concrete. And it's very fitting because this is some of your idea. So, just a month or two ago, I came to you and I said, man, I enjoy doing the podcast. I'm glad we have the podcast, but I just feel like I need more purpose behind the podcast. Like I want to know that it's great to have discussions with believers. It's great to have, and every discussion we had in the past, if you go back and listen to it, was centered around Christ. And there was a takeaway to be a disciple for sure. So I'm not diminishing any of that, but I just gave myself a thumbs up. I don't know if you guys see that. That's so funny. If you're watching the video on YouTube, for some reason, certain reactions on my computer are giving like these bubble thumbs ups. So whatever.
We'll have to look into Riverside and adjust that setting. We're learning as we go.
We are. It's not purposeful. That's okay. That makes it fun. But this is some of your thoughts at play here, and so. I do believe that this is a great way to do a podcast, have very interesting discussions with very interesting people, some of which will be very ordinary people and some of which will seem like they're extraordinary, but they all started ordinary. Yeah. None of us, in my opinion, start out extraordinary in our faith. Even the most extraordinary probably, I know, have a story of where they were ordinary when God called them. So this podcast is for all of us, no matter where we are in our walk. And so what a lot of people don't know, and I don't even know 100% of it. So it's truly, I will be inquisitive in this conversation and learn about you, Alex, but I know the high level. But I mean, you've been a disciple maker for many years. It wasn't like you recently came into, I like discipleship, so I want to apply for this job at a discipleship organization. It was your DNA. It's the DNA of what God put in you. And so that's why you were such a great fit for what we're doing here and to have you on board. And I'll just say it publicly that Alex is such a blessing to me personally. I tell my wife, like, I get off the phone with Alex so many times and I'm like, oh, thank God for Alex. And my wife will just laugh. And she's like, man, I don't hear that out of you that often. And the truth being known, when you manage people in life, oftentimes you get off conversations frustrated a lot of times. And I can tell you that I get off the phone with Alex and I'm just amazed at the ownership mentality he takes around Ordinary Movement, the way that he pushes us forward in ways that I could never do. My mind doesn't even work the way his does in those ways. And so I'm just so proud to be in partnership with him in this pursuit, and just so thankful to the Lord that he brought somebody in to come alongside me when I was pretty burnt out and pretty kind of frustrated with where we were going to, like, what do we do? I just felt like I was at the end of my rope with some things, and you've really helped. So I just want to say that publicly because I mean it so much.
Hey, it's an honor to me. And for those who don't know, maybe the backstory, like Jeremy bootstrapped with a team, pulling together while running his own business endeavors, everything that's already happened with a very, very small team to get where we are today at the Ordinary Movement. And, when you and I crossed paths, I saw the opportunity of like, man, the Big C church needs a better solution to provide support and discipleship. And I really do believe still to this day, Ordinary Movement has this incredible tool and opportunity to bring that solution. I'm excited for what God's doing. It's an honor to be able to run with you.
Well, thanks, man. I appreciate that. And yeah, I was doing too many things. It's funny. I can look at other people's lives and be like, hey, you need to pull back from this. You got this. But in my own life, I was the visionary, the operations guy, the HR guy. I mean, I was doing everything, and you can't do that without getting burnt out. So
I think some might have been that tension of like with business, you felt maybe more freedom to take risks. And I wonder how much of that was like with the discipleship platform and the weight of what God put on your heart. Like, was there a reservation around treating it the same way? I don't know.
No, there was. I mean, some of it is. This is a discipleship conversation, and we'll get off this pretty quick. This isn't a commercial for Ordinary Movement per se, but part of it is like, what is God calling you to? Just because it's hard doesn't mean God's not calling you to it, right? So there's that tension of like, well, I'm not just going to solve every problem by hiring somebody or making it easy for myself, because maybe God wants me to suffer is the wrong word, but you take up my cross, right? And I think that's part. I know that's part of discipleship. In fact, you sent a video just recently that the gentleman was saying that is a big part of discipleship is this struggle and this and surrender, and oftentimes it requires some sacrifice and such. So it was that, and then it was the other side of it, which is how are we going to pay for it? Because I mean, you know my heart on this, Alex, and I've mentioned it maybe before in the podcast, but I don't want to be a fundraising organization. I want to be a discipleship organization. Yeah. And I never want people in the organization to feel like a product. So I don't want to invest in somebody and then them think, well, the reason Jeremy invested in me is because I have a pocketbook that he can hopefully get some money to help fund this organization. And so between those tensions, it made it difficult. But I'm working through that. I'm getting better at that. So let's get into your story. So as I mentioned in the intro, and this isn't a bad thing, by the way. I think it's great. Obviously, I hired him. But he doesn't have a formal college degree.
Yeah.
He's not been through seminary or any formal training in ministry. Is that correct? I mean, I guess
have like some certificate stuff, but
but not something that like a denomination would like put a letter beside your name, whatever they do.
Yeah. No, and I actually hit pause on pursuing that, which we can get into if it's relevant down the road. But
okay. So my point is, Alex is an ordinary guy, But if you looked at his life, you'd say, well, he's been in ministry his whole life. Like I don't relate to him. The reality is, though, he has been in ministry his whole life, but not his whole life, but since kind of getting out of high school. But his journey wasn't, I want to be in ministry, as much as God was calling him, and he was just taking steps towards it. So I'd like to just talk through that. So first off, an interesting thing is Alex has been arrested in Yellowstone National Park. I don't know this story. I cannot figure out, other than touching a bison or something, like, how do you get arrested in Yellowstone National Park? There's no like clubs there. Like, what were you doing?
I was driving down the highway. I was probably high, and I was like just living life, I was doing this epic road trip after high school on my way back to Virginia, where I was going to visit all the national parks and take photos. I had like a big long range telephoto lens, and I was fly fishing in Yellowstone National Park and like trying to get awesome photographs of animals. And then I did not have a seatbelt on. That's how I got busted. And the park rangers saw that. And I think they saw the Colorado plates. And you guys got to think, like, this is back in 2008, before nobody, now nobody cares about pot, like, as far as like the legal system, unless they're just bored and they need to like make some extra money or something. But like at that point, I was like red flagged immediately. And so they pulled me over, and conversations very quickly led to me getting slammed against the hood of the cop car and handcuffed behind my back and thrown in the back of the car. And all of a sudden I was like, I mean, to fast forward into that, like I felt like I genuinely, like, I grew up in church. I was running from God, and I was doing this road trip instead of following God. And it was like my come to Jesus moment, where I felt like God said, like, the wages of sin are death. You've known this. Here's a sample. And they put me back in my Jeep, and I was arrested. I had possession of marijuana at the time. And I remember the cop car, he actually saw a Bible that I had like packed away that I was like avoiding reading because I was running from God. And it really just felt like, for me, like I was Jonah at that moment. And he was like, go be the good Christian boy you know you are. And
he said that.
Yeah. And I literally, like, I knew God was calling me to go do this discipleship school with YWAM, like a gap year program, where it would like focus on discipleship while we do backpacking and mountaineering and all this stuff, and then go to Kyrgyzstan for outreach missions. I was running from that because I wanted to go to Virginia Tech. So I was doing this road trip, avoiding going to YWAM. And then this happened. And that was the like catalyst.
So, YWAM, so Kevin Daly, which has led an Ordinary Movement group, his whole family's doing YWAM for the year.
Okay.
Which is really cool. So to connect you guys. Well, that's interesting. So I wonder if they saw the lack of a seatbelt, or they saw like smoke coming out your windows. I can think like Cheech and Chong or whatever it is.
And I mean, I was so stupid. Like I all of a sudden, like once the cop car, like the lights went on, like I buckled up, and they're like, do you know why we pulled you over? I was like, I have no idea. I mean, I was 18. Like,
oh man, that's funny. I can't imagine you high, Alex. That would be a funny sight. Oh my gosh. So that got your attention. So you felt like, so you grew up in a Christian home.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
Okay.
I mean, initially, like my dad passed away when I was younger. Before he passed away, he gave his life to Jesus. Before that, it was not a Christian home. Like, my mom was taking us to church. He was very,
how old were
hostile
you when your
towards
father
God.
passed away?
9.
Yeah. I mean, how do you think that still affects you to this day? Or I mean, how much is that? Because my father passed away when I was 30, and I feel like daily it affects me. Not necessarily always negative, but it has a huge effect on me.
Yeah.
How do you feel?
I feel like so much more of the impact was when I was younger, like in those formative middle school, high school years, and not having a dad.
Yeah.
At this point in life, I've gone so long where God has brought people into my life as mentors, as dads at different seasons, and I feel like I've kind of found God as father. And so I'm sure it does impact me in different ways now. I'm just less aware of how it does.
Yeah.
But the big impact was me feeling lonely, feeling isolated, feeling abandoned, and angry when I was younger, which led to that, like, growing up in church, believing God was real, but not wanting to follow him because I wanted to follow other pursuits and other ideals that people said were fun and worthwhile that were against God.
So how old are you now?
34.
34. Yeah. When you get in your 40s, you'll start analyzing more about what the death of it's crazy for me. And a lot of people I know, when they get in their 40s, it's like You must have to go back to counseling to figure out where all these thoughts came from. But well, that's interesting. So you grew up in a Christian home, but I think you've told me in the past that you came to Jesus like after high school. No?
Yeah. So that was the getting pulled over was the catalyst. And that was just at that point, like I knew why I was doing this discipleship school, which I knew God was leading me to do. I kind of got a bait and switch. Like I was looking into it because of the wilderness instructor, like the backpacking experiences. And then all of a sudden it hit me like, this is a discipleship school. And I knew from my like whole entire life in church, like disciple was like, in my mind, it was like, plenty of people call themselves Christians and go to church on Sundays, but party on the weekends. That's what I wanted to be at this stage while I was running from God. And disciple was what I was running from, because that meant like, I'm going to surrender to God. Like this is my mindset at 18. And so at that point, what's that?
Is that still your mindset?
I mean, I think now you can't really be a Christian without being a disciple. There comes a point, where it's, there's grace, but there also comes this point where it's like, if you're going to believe in Jesus, you have to follow him, and everybody begins with believing, but that very quickly turns into, who are you believing, and the weight and the gravity of that. And faith without works is dead. There's this gravitas to, if you believe in him, you will follow him and obey him. So I think in some ways, like that's still, if you're going to believe in Jesus, you are a disciple. The question mark is whether or not you are being one.
Yeah, that's an interesting, trust me, I don't have the answer for this. And it's probably, some people will cringe at the question. This is just ordinary discussions, guys. But like, you think about somebody's journey, you said it, you can't be a Christian without being a disciple. But I wonder if there is a point. I think being a Christian is being a disciple. It's like, what level of disciple are you being? Because disciple is following Jesus, right? The commandments he teaches and the ways of his life. So I do wonder if there's like you can't do this obviously, but if there's like a timeline where it's like, okay, you can be a Christian for this long without really being like all in. But at some point, I know this is not biblical. I'm just saying in my mind, at some point, like the rubber's going to meet the road. Like 40 years in, if you're still like drinking milk, like at some point it's like, are you really a disciple? Anyhow, I may be off topic. Maybe we cut that out, but,
I think I
do think there's a period of grace. There has to be
100%. And I think what you find is like, if to be a Christian is to be a disciple, people then start out as young and mature disciples, not realizing they're called to be disciples, and this invitation of like, people say yes to Jesus without really knowing the cost and what it means to follow Jesus in American culture. So if we're sharing the gospel in the Arab world, like they need to know, and they want to know, what does it mean? Who is Jesus and what does it mean to follow him before they give their life to him? I think in the American culture, people just say yes to Jesus, and they just quickly say, yeah, like I'll believe in him. They don't even know what he taught or what he stands for or how it's going to impact their life. And then they start getting into it. And they kind of started that young and mature, but then they realize, I don't want to be a disciple. I don't want to surrender. I don't want to deny myself, take up my cross. I don't want to be like Jesus. I just wanted to get the label Christian, go to church on Sunday, and still live the way I wanted to, just to
get eternal life.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think that's kind of, there's this cultural nuance around this that we feel in the United States is very different than the outlook it would have been in the days of Jesus, when there was a deep cost, and in other parts of the world.
Yeah, I think some of this can get into the topic of who's saved and not, and that's not for us. We'll never figure that out. I can't sit on a jury and tell you if somebody's guilty of a criminal crime, let alone their salvation. I do know that from my experience that you can't follow Jesus without having him call you to surrender and sacrifice and laying down of your life and walking out calling in your life. So, but what I heard, you didn't say it, but what I think I heard from you was, we do a good job of pointing people initially to Jesus, but maybe within the big C, we're not doing a great job of showing people what it looks like to be a disciple.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So back to your journey. Sorry, that was a little sidetrack there, but so you found you really, the rubber met the road when you were handcuffed up against your car, And he said, why don't you be a good boy and get back to Jesus? And so from that point, you said you felt called to YWAM before, and then I know you went to YWAM after that. YWAM is, give us like a 10-second YWAM.
So Youth of the Mission. So at that point, like I knew I needed to give my life to Jesus. It was a like, now I'm going to repent and follow, not just believe that he is Lord. And I had already known he was leading me to go do Youth of the Mission, this discipleship school. And Youth of the Mission is this massive worldwide missions organization that kind of really focuses on these discipleship schools. There's kind of these gap year schools where they take young people into these programs for anywhere from like 6 to 12 months and then take them out on a short-term missions trip as well. So it's like usually like 3 months discipleship school and then 3 months of an outreach phase while you're still doing the discipleship stuff. And then I was with them for a full year.
Were you in Hawaii?
No, I was in Bishop, California the entire time, which was amazing. I love it there. Tons of climbing, fly fishing, backpacking, mountaineering, the Sierras, and then we went to Kyrgyzstan.
So YWAM is smart. They do their places. They do their discipleship training in some really cool places. California, Hawaii,
all over the world, all different types of bases. And it's really cool because, you know, if you think about like our passion, this topic is like discipleship. Like YWAM has this decentralized ministry, which is where there's pros and cons. Like there's some bases are not as great as others because it is decentralized. There's less accountability. And we're talking about like a massive worldwide organization.
Oh, they're decentralized, really?
The way it's done is each base has a lot of autonomy, but there's still things that they buy into because they're under that name of YWAM, so they have to agree to whatever, you know, we can get a YWAM director on. But then there's still a ton of flexibility in that.
By the way.
Yeah. You know, so that director can then say, well, I'm passionate about backpacking. And I think taking people out on these backpacking trips where they're going to be faced with challenges, obstacles, you know, conflict with team and, you know, all this stuff makes for great character development opportunity to be challenged. We're like Jesus, and we'll bring in a Bible teacher every week, pastor, whoever, that'll talk about how to follow Jesus, how to pray, what it means to be a son of God, all this stuff while you're out there in that environment.
That's pretty cool. So this is going to be maybe a tough one to answer, but I think people in the Christian community say this a lot. And I think people that are ordinary, like a lot of people listening to this podcast are like, okay, that's great. What does that mean? You said you felt called by God. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? Like, what did that mean to you? Like, so you felt called to God to go to YWAM. Like, what does that put some context to that? Like, make that understandable to somebody that maybe hasn't heard the audible voice of God or felt the prompting of the Holy Spirit. Like, what did that look like to you?
Yeah. So I'd had these experiences throughout kind of like middle school, high school, where I'd felt God move in my life. Felt like he spoke to me. I felt like he invited me to follow him. So I never really struggled with, do I believe in Jesus? It was, do I want to follow Jesus? And do I want to obey him? Do I want to follow him? And so, and I wanted to be in a relationship with him because I did believe in him and because he did, but I also really struggled with like, do I want to submit my life to his ways? And I think, you know, probably one of the last experiences was like in high school. I went to this youth retreat up in the mountains, Estes Park. And I remember having this moment where like, you know, I didn't have any friends there because I wasn't, you know, I went to this thing. I don't even know why I went. It was a youth retreat and I wasn't wanting to follow Jesus. I was still partying on the weekends, but like I went to this thing and I remember one night at worship, like the presence of God impacted me. And I remember just like, I remember kneeling on the floor in the back of this auditorium and I remember sensing the presence of God. And I remember like saying, I want to follow you. And I remember God not like an audible voice, but I just felt like he really spoke to me. And I remember him then saying, then you need to give up your friends. Because I knew that my friends were the biggest obstacle that season in high school. Yeah. If I was actually going to live it out and successfully follow Jesus. And I remember saying, you know, I remember crying and I ended up not successfully doing that and did not obey God. And I struggled to follow God for that remaining season of high school. But I'd had these kind of moments and then I was praying about what was next and I was looking into it. I had like actually gotten into like the John Eldridge, what's that book called? Like
Wild at Heart.
yeah, like I listened to the audio tape of that because I hated reading when I was in high school. And I really I was really struggling. Wanted to follow Jesus, didn't want to give up my life of sin. And then the more I was praying, looking into it, the more I felt like God was leading me to do YWAM. And then I got scared to death, realizing it was a discipleship school, and ran. And so that's kind of where it was like, yeah, I felt like God was leading me that way, but I was running.
Yeah. Interesting. So I'm asking you some tough questions. I know that, but
No,
you're a great guest to do this with, because I know you well. So you said you felt like God was telling you to get rid of your friends.
Mm-hmm.
I think obviously God said it, so it's great advice, but I think it's great advice in general. You know, there's a quote in one of in our workbook that says I think it says it, but you're the average of the 5 people you hang out with the most, right?
Yeah.
So, and I tell my kids that all the time. But what went through my head when you said that was, man, there's probably some adults listening to this conversation right now that need to get rid of some of their friends because it may be hindering them from doing what God's calling them to do. But then immediately what went through my mind was, yeah, but how do you balance that with discipleship, right? Because part of what we're called to in discipleship is to share the gospel with there's the thumbs up again.
It always showed Riverside.
I love it, dude. I want to keep it. So part of what we're called to as disciples is to reach the lost, right? And to be disciple makers that point them to Christ.
Yeah.
So where's that line in your mind? And maybe it's different with adults and kids, or maybe it's different. I don't know. I don't want to give you the answer, but I'm kind of thinking through the answer as I say that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have thoughts. I think there's layers. So there's obviously, like, the Bible also says, like, bad company corrupts good character. There's Proverbs talks about people you hang out with.
You just went up my quote. You went with a Bible first.
A little bit of 11. I mean, we just keep going, right? But like, so then there's like, okay, you are not following Jesus. You want to follow Jesus. You don't have anyone around you that's following Jesus. They're probably going to be pulling you away from Jesus because of what they like to do and how they like to live and what they're into. Yeah. And it's just going to be really hard, like, to continue to run with those people, especially I think in like high school, because you're in such a, like, you're with the same friends every single day, and then you hang out with those friends on the weekend. I think high school is harder perhaps than being an adult, but I mean, I wouldn't die on that hill, but like, so in that sense, like, part of it is knowing that, like, I was not going to be able to be a Christian and follow Jesus and be in healthy relationship with him and still living and doing life and hanging out with and partying with my friends. And I really couldn't be friends with those friends unless I continued to live that life and party with them, because that was the only thing we had in common, was getting drunk and chasing girls and trying to get high and looking for better pot. Like, that was my life. Right.
Yeah. I think that's so, like, what you said is, like, what came to my mind is you can't help somebody that's drowning if you're drowning yourself. Right. So it wasn't like you were healthy and you were around people that were possibly pulling you in the wrong direction. You were in the middle of it with them. And so, I mean, that's probably part of that answer. It's like, when is it the right time to?
So I can come back to that then. So, like, I had this benefit of going away for a year and then becoming strong in my faith, like strong with Jesus. And when I came back, I felt like God told me to totally, like, do a, like, let go release. Like, you weren't going to be able, like, I just knew I was not strong enough to be in that crowd and follow Jesus. I think there could be others out there who, like, somehow they can still hang out with that crowd and they're like, yeah, I don't do that anymore. But I don't think the average person, I think sometimes people just need to totally.
I don't think there's many people that can. I think you can associate, but hanging out on a regular basis,
it's hard. I don't know that they can either. I couldn't, and so, like,
you hang out in the pig pen, you're going to smell like pigs. Like, it just happens.
Okay. So, like, one of the reasons you're talking about is because you see Jesus hanging out with sinners. Yeah. But it's not that he's just hanging out, like, talking about sin. Like, he's pointing them to the kingdom.
You're right.
He's influencing them. So, so if we were to, like, I'll get to my story in a second. I think for me, the question mark is, in any given environment, are we the ones who are the influence, or are they influencing us? So even in our Christian environment right now, it's like, if you feel drawn to know God more and really invest in discipleship and disciple making, but all the people that you hang out with don't care about any of that except for, like, going to church on Sunday and talking about how whatever, like at some point you're going to realize like, man, like they're having way greater influence on me than I am on them. And if I want to grow in this area, I need to be around people that also have the same common goal so that we're influencing one another in this direction that we want to go. And I think that's the, like, you know, when Jesus was in that environment with sinners, they were not influencing him to sin. He was the one that they were all drawn to, and he was influencing them. And so my kind of coaching when I talk with people that I'm mentoring or whatnot is like, yeah, like you could be in that environment with people that you used to be friends with, or still maybe are friends with, or are acquaintances with, or, you know, you could go to a bar. You know, the question mark though is like, are you the one influencing people, you know, in a Jesus way, or are you all of a sudden quiet, timid, you know, you can't talk without actually joining into a conversation that, you know, doesn't please God. Like that's that, like you can tell when things are in balance about Jesus or out of balance, and you're getting pulled in or you're dying.
Man, that's great. I think that's great advice. I mean, it's worth listening to the full podcast just to get that, which is what are your goals? What is God calling you to? What are your spiritual goals, your goals in life, right? And analyze your friendships in your community. And are those people helping you get closer to that, or are they pulling you away from that, right? Number one. And then number two, well, it's the same, it's the same analogy, is like you said, are you influencing them towards this goal? Yeah, that's great. And then it's like some people in my life don't influence me towards my ultimate goal, but I still spend time with them. I just can't spend the amount of time with them that would then cause me to be negatively influenced by their activities. And so I think that's a great gauge. That's awesome.
So like once I gave my life to Jesus and I came back to the Springs, I was very calculated in that, like, I knew I couldn't go back and hang out in a large group setting with all those old friends. I probably would just cave and go back to that way I used to live. So I did not go back into that setting ever, but I did then start reaching out to some of those individual people. And I did actually like talk about Jesus, talk about what changed my life, you know, and invited them along. They weren't into it. So it wasn't that I like totally abandoned. I did, you know, in a calculated way that I felt like would allow me to share my faith. And actually I started seeing people give their lives to Jesus.
Wow.
Around that time, like when I came back and I re-entered and I learned how to share my faith, but I just had to be very calculated about what environment that I could stay solid in.
That's great. Okay, so let's get into your story a little more. We're kind of pushing here time. That's my fault. I've asked a lot of questions. I think they were great questions, Alex. I'm just saying they were great questions.
Yeah, no, they're good. The story. Hopefully somebody's entertained by it.
That was a joke. Sometimes Alex doesn't get my humor. That is a funny thing within our organization, is sometimes Alex doesn't understand when I'm joking.
I suck at humor, and Brittany would tell you that I like her coaching because I tried it. Like I used to speak on platforms. I still do at times, and she just tells me not to try being funny.
Well, you're funny when you're not trying to be funny. When you try to be funny, you're not that funny.
Yeah, it just fails. I'm not good at humor.
But you're a funny guy. I'll tell you that.
Thank you.
Okay. So again, we're talking to the ordinary people, ordinary person. So you went to YWAM. That starts feeling unordinary to me. That starts feeling like ministry. It starts feeling like you went to some ministry training, right? But tell me, so then you get back into the quote unquote real world, right? You're no longer in the YWAM thing. I mean, how did you walk out discipleship as an ordinary person? Tell me how your journey would relate to somebody listening, and what can they learn from it?
Okay. So when I came back from YWAM, I knew I needed to invest deeply in my relationship with God. So there was just a fixed time that I made daily routine out of my own desire, not out of like guilt or expectation, where I just focused on like getting in the word and prayer. And a lot of times that was the evening. Like I'm not a morning person. And it was really easy that season of my life to like in the evening, instead of hanging out with my old friends and partying, at the evenings. Yeah. Like I would pray, I would read a ton. And then I knew I needed a new community. And so I just immersed myself in church, found that one church wasn't enough because I was young and single at that time. So I went to two different churches, got involved in two different young adult groups, started helping with the youth ministry. So it initially started with like needing community.
Yeah.
And then it was like, but I also knew from my time at YWAM, like I knew I wanted to engage in serving. Like I knew I wanted to help. I wanted to impact. So once I had more community fixed and being around the right environments, then I just started to look for areas to serve because I knew that was practical. And that was part of like, how do I make disciples? Well, you start serving. That just made sense. And so I started to serve anywhere I could. It began with stacking chairs. I remember like the very first Sunday I visited, they were stacking chairs. So I just jumped in and started stacking chairs, and people started to hear my story. And then they began to invite me to do more. So it kind of led with like very practically finding areas to just help contribute in, which then led to, hey, will you help lead small groups? Or will you help do the intro for the young adult thing? Or will you help do a Bible study for the young adults group? Or will you help lead, these different small groups with the youth? And so,
and are you paid? Are you paid by the church at this point, or
no? So I was doing roofing part-time. Okay. I was leading high ropes course and low ropes course facilitation for camp part-time. And I was a tour guide for Cave of the Winds part-time. And then I started to.
What is so this is in Colorado. By the way, Alex does not live in Colorado now, which is kind of interesting because I live in Colorado.
I know, it's funny.
And now he lives in Virginia. And when he was in Colorado, I was in Virginia. So we swapped.
Yep.
So what is Cave of the Winds? What is that? I don't even know about it.
It's just a big, like kind of touristy cave venue over there, right outside of Manitou. Right outside of Manitou. Yeah, it'd be like that.
Yeah.
And so, and the funny thing was, like, they tried to get us to be funny. So I was a tour guide, and I tried to be
that's
funny.
where you learned your humor, in a cave. That makes sense.
And when no one laughs, you tell them that you're joking, so then they laugh at you. Yeah. So, like,
that's where you learned it. It's all coming together now. It's all coming together.
So I'm like, I mean, prior to YWAM, it was like landscaping. I used to clean offices coming out of YWAM. I'm like living on my own. Parents had moved to North Carolina. I'm sleeping out of a sleeping bag on a.
So you're very ordinary. You're roofing, you're working, you're doing all these things, but you're still feeling called to do more in your faith, not out of obligation, but out of love for Christ, because He first loved us. We love Him, right?
So here's how I got there. In YWAM, I knew I wanted to follow God, and when we were in the mountains doing this discipleship school, I remember like they were giving you time to do devotional, and I remember reading where it talked about like I wanted to love God. It was the most important thing, to love God with your heart, all your heart, soul, mind, strength, right?
Yeah.
And I remember feeling like I didn't.
According to Jesus, it's number one commandment.
Yeah, like I didn't feel love for God though, and that really bothered me. And when I read Jesus say that if you love me, you'll obey me, that for me was like one of the biggest like eye-opening moments of my life. Not out of legalism, but out of freedom of like, man, even if I don't feel love towards God like I feel towards others, I can show love to Him by just obeying Him. And so then it was like, well, then when I got to Colorado Springs, it was like, hey, I can continue to obey God and show Him that I love Him. And it led to feeling love for Him because I'm doing a relationship with Him and for Him. And so I don't know. I know for other people, like
as you served Him and obeyed Him, that you went from having a dryness around love to feeling His love?
Well, here's the funny thing is when you begin serving Him and you begin to be invited into other positions of leadership, you need Him to show up.
Yeah.
Otherwise you're doing all your strength. That's terrible. And you don't even know what to do, and it's not going to work. So like when I began to lead other people, there was this like, I don't know how to do this. And it forced me to dig in deeper into prayer and relationship with Jesus and needing to hear His voice as I was leading. So for me, it just kind of had this circular effect. And I know for others like that, there's this, I think it's just because they're in church history that can quickly go into like some legalism stuff. But for me, it's never felt that way. It's just felt like freeing.
Yeah, I see that.
But I think people, when they begin leading, like when you go from like following and attending, there's this place where people, I think people tend, what I've seen in my church experience, in my own experience, people kind of plateau. They're like, man, I'm praying, I'm reading. They're there to feel kind of stagnant in their relationship with Jesus. And when you go into this next stage of like trying to lead, trying to step out, trying to do impact, trying to do discipleship and disciple others, there's this new like responsibility. And we notice this when people lead groups, where all of a sudden that person, it's just like there's this whole next level where it's like, man, I need God to show up.
That's right.
And it forces us to rely on him and depend on him. So it's not our own strength. And you get to, it's like a whole new dimension of relationship, I think, opens up for people, because now they're doing life with God instead of just wanting God just to randomly show up in their life when they need him or want him
Which
to.
is why it's so important to have high challenge in our faith, I believe, because that challenge is what brings us to that next level. Just like, I mean, yeah, I can give a million analogies. We all know them, but yeah, that's great. So that's within the church. So you did, we're going to fit a lot into this last like 5 to 10 minutes here, but when did you go to, I don't know, you were in the Middle East or something, weren't you, at some point?
Yeah. So a few different times. I did the Kyrgyzstan's kind of more like Central Asia, but I did Kyrgyzstan. And then I went to, so I was serving in these different things. So I was engaged, really, I would say, in disciple making.
Is this through YWAM or is this after YWAM?
Kyrgyzstan was with YWAM. Then I'm in Colorado Springs. I had started college and was thinking about Bible school because I just didn't know what to do with my life.
Mm-hmm.
But I had an interest. By the way, I never wanted to be in ministry, but then I started to kind of notice this pull into it. And so it's like, it was just never this, like, I didn't ever see myself as a pastor or in ministry, but I wanted to serve God. And I noticed that I just didn't feel equipped. And so I thought maybe, like, while I was doing college, I just enrolled at a community college, that I'd look into Bible school. Went to Egypt. I helped co-lead a team of young adults on a short-term trip to Egypt. Came back and really felt like I wanted to see more discipleship, more people led to Jesus, the power of God move, and not just like the normal mission trip experience.
Yeah.
And that then led to me basically feeling invited and then feeling like God said go, to drop out of school, drop out of Bible school, college, drop out of it all, pack my bags, and I moved to Central America as a full-time long-term missionary, and was there for over 6 years.
6 years.
Yeah.
Where at?
Mexico and Nicaragua mostly. Working with, in Mexico,
Cancun.
No, not at all. We were up in the mountains working with indigenous
work and
that was our running joke, because in the missions world, I think there's such a now people perception based on short-term trips that missions is going to all these fun places and doing a fun vacation.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so much work to be done in missions that doesn't look like that at all. But that's what people are experiencing on those trips.
Yeah.
So we worked in the mountains with indigenous people. Spanish is their second language, in communities where they had never heard the gospel.
Spanish is second language?
Spanish is their second language.
What? I keep getting a thumbs up. That's hilarious. What was their primary then?
Now what?
Can you speak that?
No, it's an Aztec dialect.
That would have been epic.
And so I learned Spanish in Guatemala. Actually met my wife, Brittany, there in Guatemala.
Oh, really?
I was learning Spanish. She did the world race, which was like 11 months, 11 countries, serving Jesus.
Wow. Wow.
And then we had a cartel threat, got kicked out of Mexico, landed in Nicaragua. A family and I, as a team, we planted a church in Nicaragua, but we had to do, there's a ton into all of that. And then I went to the Middle East again recently, to Jordan and Egypt, to go visit teams of people that are working and training missionaries to go to closed countries with unreached people.
Yeah, so the Lord put on your heart in a big way missions work, which is interesting because you're now director of operations of a discipleship movement that's currently in the U.S. Hopefully we can become beyond the borders of the U.S. Well, we did have somebody sign up for our app in Canada recently.
Hey.
So that's cool. But so how do you wrestle with that? I mean, how do you reconcile that?
Yeah. So I feel at peace about this. I feel like God has put in my. I feel like God,
this wasn't going to be your resignation speech.
Well, actually, Jeremy, I've really been feeling. So I feel like God has charged me, and I think in assignments, not like people get really caught up. Sometimes I think about like, where is God calling, and is God like I just think God kind of usually gives us maybe calling to the next step. Like I don't try to get too caught up on like my calling.
I like that. A lot. Assignments. That's
called to know Jesus and to live for him. That's the obvious calling. And then there's these like, what's the next step? And I feel like God has charged me as an assignment to mobilize disciple makers. And I do feel like there's an emphasis that God has put on my heart that I'm responsible for mobilizing people to the 1040, which is where the 40% of the world lives that has limited to no access to Jesus. I mobilizing missionaries to close hard to reach, unreached countries is incredibly hard. And as I got into that, I also had this deep conviction for discipleship of feeling like, man, we need to do a better job at helping the American church not be churchgoers, but be disciples and make disciples.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And the more I began to look at the sending problem that we have around missions to people who have not heard the gospel, the more I realized it's less of a sending problem, more of a discipleship problem that we have now.
You're saying sending with a D, not sinning, right?
Sending problem of missionaries.
Just want to make sure.
it's actually less of a sending, not sending, problem and more of a discipleship problem.
Yeah.
Because, the reality is like I was going to churches and I still am, like, I think it's worthwhile, but like, to go and invite people to go to the field. Well, there's people just don't care about going to the field and giving up their life and risking their life and doing disciple making if they're not already doing it here.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not teaching people how to do really good disciple making here in their own fun, creative, unique way where they take ownership of their faith, not just go and attend. We need to do a better job at that. And there's so many pastors that want to, that are trying to figure out how. And that's where I feel like Ordinary Movement, it's like, hey, let's resource and equip the church to do discipleship better, to really engage in being disciples, not just followers and not just fans, and consumers. And I think that ultimately will lead to better sending. And so I don't know. I think they're not meant to actually be apart from each other. I think good discipleship has this, Jesus' heart for go make disciples. He cared about the here, the there, and the over there. And part of the challenge we have as Christians is to have this local and global mindset. Our focus as Ordinary Movement is definitely focused on the United States right now, and saying, how do we equip normal, ordinary, everyday, believers to be disciples and make disciples? And I think that is one of the big, huge voids that if we do a great job at helping fill, will ultimately be a catalyst for seeing people hear, be able to hear the gospel. Otherwise,
I agree. Our primary focus is pointing people to Jesus, so they fall so madly in love with him that they actually follow his commandments and his teachings, and they hear his voice, and they want to move out in his calling. And I just believe that when we do that, we make disciples and make disciples, obviously. But how they make disciples, and that's why I'm excited about this next season of our podcast, is we're going to see that the way that God calls us to make disciples is different for everybody.
Yeah.
And yes, we want people to utilize this tool, Ordinary Movement, Ordinary Men and Ordinary Women's groups, or co-ed groups, Ordinary Movement groups, right? We want them to utilize that, but we also want them to ultimately do what God puts on their heart. And so what I envision is, as this grows, is we will see many people go abroad, many people go to these unreached nations that have been hopefully catalyzed through this process of Ordinary Movement. So the goal isn't to create a holy huddle in the U.S. The goal is to point people to Jesus in a way that allows them to hear from him and do what you did in your life, which is hear from him, take a step, hear from him, take a step, and then where that leads you, right? So I don't see this at all, and you and I have discussed this a little bit, but I don't see this at all as like this is about the U.S. To me, this is about anything that's about the gospel, anything that's about the kingdom is about whatever God wants to do, right? And so if we get a ton of groups out of it, awesome. If we get not a ton of groups, but we get a ton of people mobilizing, then that's great. And it's a cool example. And I can't say that Ordinary Movement is the catalyst or not. I think it had something to do with it, but they could tell us, and we'll probably have them on the podcast actually. But the Dailies, Kevin and Aaron Daly both led were in Ordinary Movement groups, led Ordinary Movement groups, and then now their whole families at YWAM because God put mission on their heart. And so
Yeah.
it's exciting to see that.
Can I throw out kind of I heard Francis Chan share this analogy, and it is for himself, but it conveyed what I think is this reality, right? So like we're right now just trying to help the church recognize like they're called to fish. Like that's our, like, if people are already fishing, we're like, heck yeah, like we'd love for you to use our tool if it helps you, but like you're fishing, like keep doing what God's called you to.
Yeah.
You know how to fish, right? Like we're really, I think you oftentimes, you love the idea of like awaken the found. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. To awaken the found, to reach the lost. Yep.
Yeah. Like we're really trying to make, like, helping people figure out how to go from Christian to disciple making disciple. And Francis Chan, shared this analogy of like, if there's, two different ponds stocked with fish, and you and I both love to fish. Like imagine in Colorado, like everybody's down like in the city, stacked around this pond, full of stocked, I don't know, whatever. We can just say rainbow trout. But there's just line after line, and you're crossing lines, and you're like shoulder to shoulder, and everybody's fishing for the same fish. Well, right now we're like, our concern is just getting people to recognize they're called to fish.
Yeah.
It's this beautiful opportunity. But then there's the, like, once you begin fishing, you might recognize like, man, like, I don't even know, like all of my community are church people, or like you got to start then figuring out, how do you fish effectively? That's a whole next step, right? Like that we want to get into with these interviews, is the, like, how do you reach new people that are far from God, unchurched people, your neighbors, the people in your community, the people in your city, right? And then for some people, they're going to be at the stage after they've been doing that for a while where they feel like, I've done a lot of different things, I've reached a lot of different people, and they're going to start to recognize, like, man, there's a lot of other people fishing here, but there's other lakes that are huge, full of fish, and no one's fishing there.
Yeah.
And it might be the Northeast of the United States, might be a different city, in their own state. It might be them moving from one suburb to another part of the city where they recognize, I think this is a whole different, like, level of thinking and disciple making that people get to. It's not where I would invite people to go to first at all. Like, we just want to get people fishing, but like,
yeah, it's interesting. I don't mean this towards anyone. So if this stings you, I don't mean it per se to do that. I just maybe challenge you. But I hear a lot of Christians saying, I need to move out of this community and move into a new community because it's a Christian community. Like, I've actually seen people move out of regions that are untouched because of political whatever, right? And move to areas that are very very faith-filled and Christian communities so that they can be with people of like mind. I don't know that that's wrong. I'm not per se passing judgment, but I do know that that's going to a pond that already has a bunch of people fishing in it. And I would think that if we're in so for example, what did you call it? The 1040? Is that what it's called?
Yeah, the 1040.
Yeah.
3% of all missionaries work there. 40% of the world that has no access to the gospel lives there. Yeah.
So I don't know. I hear it said all the time by ministry leaders in the Vail Valley where I live, Vail, Colorado. But we are this community is as untouched as many of those 1040 communities. Like our salvation rate, I don't know how to even is so low. The number of church people, the number of people that profess Christ. So it's almost like being in a mission field here. So that's when you said, like, maybe God's calling you to a new community. Well, maybe it could be in the U.S. Maybe it's an untouched region in the U.S., a highly liberal and whatever. I just think there's a lot of opportunity in the U.S., but there's also opportunity abroad. So it's whatever God puts on your heart. But
yeah, I don't think I wouldn't ever tell people to go, like, the big thing is we want people to shift into this missional mindset where it's not about going to church and what they're going to get out of church anymore. It's about being the church and living out what Jesus called us to live. And they begin to say, like, man, how do I find people that need to hear this message? And you begin to work through that. And your city may be more than enough suffice, or like there's not a one size fits all to this. I mean, the difference between 1040 and like where you live, Edwards, is access.
Yeah,
there,
right. 100%.
It totally, completely different. But nonetheless, the idea still is that there's people everywhere that need to be invited, that need to be, that the opportunity exists where we live. There's so many people that are unchurched, not following Jesus. And how do we get people thinking missionally? And you may not need to move. You may never need to move. It's just getting that mindset thinking though of like, how do I start catching fish?
That's right. So it's about how do you start fishing, and how do you, with your analogy. But more than anything, you and I know our hearts. We're not trying to tell people what to do in discipleship. We're just saying, get close with Lord and follow what He tells you to do. If that's going abroad, if that's staying where you are, so let's talk about that. Let's wrap this up in like 5 minutes here. But
okay,
what I'd like to do, just a quick rundown. I know we talked a lot about you in church. I know you were in ministry. You were paid ministry for a while. You were an associate pastor, a group's leader, all those things. I'm not diminishing any of that, okay? But I think for our audience, the ordinary things that you did, any person can do, will probably resonate more. And I just want to say, the things that you did, and trust me, I am all about the church, and we are all about. We want to be a complement to the local church, not a competition at all. Like we are doubling down in this next phase of like, how can we help the church disciple better, and how can we be a resource to them? So I'm all about the church. Hear me say it. But I feel like that some of your greatest impact has been outside of the church, just doing what God put on your heart in the ordinary daily life. Like, and I'd like for you to talk about a couple of those things. Like, you've helped a lot of people get into ministry. You've helped, your Jesus Club thing is such a practical thing that so many people listening could do within a local high school or school. Talk about some of those outside of the church things that you did that the ordinary person may resonate with, that may motivate them.
Yeah.
Or inspire them, I should say.
I mean, I think a few things come to mind. Like, I did begin leading small groups because I wanted to, and I just began to find opportunities to invite people into these group settings. And I began to raise up leaders through that. And both Brittany and I have been doing that for years. And we began to, before Ordinary Movement came along in the workbook, like we had been the hard way learning a lot of these principles of how do we not just do a Bible study, but actually make disciples through a small group that enables them to be disciple makers. So that would be one thing, right? Then there was like, through those environments, be it small groups or even just in the ways of serving and leading, some of this kind of, I'm sorry, but it goes back into that ministry environment. It's just like, how do we give people the platform? Like, how do I not just do all the leading, but how do I constantly look for people that have potential, that have, capacity? They just need to be invited, and they need a safe place to fail. They need a safety net to catch them if they say the wrong thing. And so we've always been because that's what we learned how to do with disciple making in these communities out in the mountains. Like, we've just been very intentional about always thinking of how do we work ourselves out of a job, not how do we do all the leading and teaching, how do we help other people learn how to do what we're doing with our small groups or, in these environments. And through that, we identified people who they were just young people who were in these church settings, who were attending church, that wanted to do more, but the only means that they thought they could do more was like they'd have to give up their career job and go to Bible school and get a pastor degree and then get a career job as a pastor. And they don't even want to do the admin work that a pastor does. They just want to do disciple making. Yeah. And so they just need to be invited into environments where they could learn how to lead. And then we just help them figure out, like, what does God put in your heart? Like being an evangelist. All right, well, like, you can still work a full-time job. And if you're into street preaching, go street preach. If you're into leading outreaches, like, here's how I did it. Like, here's how I got a team. Here's how I did the permit for the park. Here's how we planned and, did the marketing. And then people came because they wanted the food in the bounce houses. And then we shared the gospel. Like, so we just have coached people and helped people, inviting them into learning how to lead, and then inviting them to consider where God's leading them, and then doing our best to give them that space, even if it was my own, and handing that off. And then Jesus Club was one. Like, I also, I have a small marketing agency. I do some real estate. So, I have stuff in common where it's like, I just have felt attracted to business, but I always felt like ministry was supposed to be first. And so I've had this tension of like, okay, I'm in ministry, but I also have these business endeavors that I've been in, and it's allowed this high degree of flexibility. And I say that because there's people in business that, like, you could give up 2 hours during your day
Mhm.
If it
Oh,
was,
there is. Yep.
yeah, you know what I mean? Like to do ministry, however God's leading. Jesus Club is one where it's like, I didn't feel called to be a youth pastor. I was one at one point, wasn't in youth ministry. But then I saw what God was doing in high schools. And if you'd give, a handful of hours every month and show up at lunch, you get made fun of, and invite kids to an auditorium where you told them you're going to talk about Jesus and have fun. Long story short, we had up to over 400 students at one point at Massaponics, coming to this auditorium, or we'd play a game and then we'd just go straight into gospel messages. And we've seen hundreds of students give their lives to Jesus.
I mean, literally hundreds of students give their lives to Jesus.
Yeah, in a public school. And this is not just, this is going on across the United States. Like I learned this from Aaron in our area, who was doing another high school. Like they did baptisms out there in the sidewalk of the high school.
Yeah, Jesus Club. And I just want to point out, this is Alex's heart. He was working at Ordinary Movement. So he's employed in ministry, and on his time off, like he was working in his schedule, but not getting paid for it. He was running Jesus Club, right? So like, here's the real deal, Alex. I
had the conversation. I said, like, hey, I still feel called to do this. Like, if you don't feel like it fits, like, I'll just make up hours later. Like, all right, like,
and of course, I was like, I didn't require that, but I was like, this fits perfect. Yes, do it. But my point is, like, It wasn't just like, oh, I can check the box because of my job's in a ministry. It's like, no, God's called me to do this. And then he would call me or text me and say, we had like 400 students and 150 gave their life to Christ today. I'm thinking, what just happened? Like, we're trying to run an organization here with like fundraising and this and that, and you're just going to a local high school, not just, but you're just going to a local high school, providing pizza, sharing the gospel, and we're having responses like this. And it really, I feel like, of all that we've talked about, like that's the thing that I think somebody listening to today could hear and literally change the environment in a local school. It could be Jesus Club. It could be something else. Like there's so many things. And that's what I'm excited about these interviews. I'm about to do an interview with it's called the chaplain of the Appalachian Trail, right? So he just hiked the Appalachian Trail and God put on his heart to be the chaplain. Like he just self-nominated himself, right? He's been doing it for like 20 some years. It's exciting. Like he loves to hike and God let him hike along with his passion of the Lord, right? And so it's the same thing that you're doing. It's just like, man, where can I be present? Where can I disciple in my ordinary life and have an impact? And I think as we do that as ordinary people, it'll be amazing. We'll be amazed at what God can do with that.
Can I throw out an idea? And my suggestion to anyone listening is like, when you hear the things that God's led me into, most of these things I was not invited into. They were things that I had to even with the Ordinary Movement, like I had to put myself out there and say, Jeremy, like I feel like that, like I was feeling God put on my heart.
Well, because you were still full time. You were still a pastor at a church. So last thing I was going to do was
I was a pastor. I knew there was this mobilizing
a pastor from a church I just, that's not my nature. I'm not going to do that.
It wasn't, it's not about, I know.
I'm just clarifying.
But my point is though, is like these things where I've seen God show up, it's not because I'm special. I like, to your point, like I'm a college dropout, didn't finish Bible school.
You're a pretty special guy, but yeah.
But like it's just because I've been curious and I've looked for opportunity. And what I found was that like I've had to be intentional about finding opportunity. And my point in that is that anyone else can do that. Like you're probably not going to be waiting to be invited into the opportunity. God's already said, like Jesus already gave us the invitation, go. So you're invited now to go. And then find a way to make disciples. And that making disciples piece is where it's like, it might be, I tell people all the time, I've been like, I'm still thinking about this. I'm like, man, I'm so much in my church bubble that if I just do small groups, I'm gonna be around more church people again, love them. But like, there comes this point where like, I recognize I'm no longer rubbing shoulders with unchurched people and being salt and light around unchurched people. And I don't even know how to get around unchurched people anymore. And that's, by nature of leading more in ministry, that happens a lot, but also by nature of church and us building community, it happens a lot. And I've been thinking again of like, maybe I've got to I find a passion hobby, like Bitcoin. Like I'm a Bitcoin nerd, love it or hate it, whatever. But like, there's people in Fredericksburg who might like that probably have no church thing. I could do a meetup and just have fun for the sake of meeting other people who don't know Jesus and are in church and actually get to meet people again outside of my bubble.
Mm-hmm.
And I throw that idea there of like gardening, sewing, mountain biking. Like we really, I just feel like we need to invite people to be creative again about like finding opportunities, being curious, test it out. If it fails, learn from it, try something different, but have fun finding your space where you can rub shoulders with new people and make disciples.
Well, that's a wrap. I mean, what more do we need? That was it. So guys, man, that is great. Don't wait for someone to invite you. So you have to go out and find your opportunities, right? You have to hear from the Lord and go out sometimes and make it happen. That's why he birthed it in you. If it was already existing at times, then there's no reason to birth it in you, because God is doing that because there's a void and he wants you to fill it. So if anything, I mean, Alex, you're just a awesome conversationalist. I love talking to you. Great wisdom. Your life is an inspiration. I feel like I asked too many questions at the beginning. We really didn't get into some of the practical things that you have done, but you really are just an unbelievable example of what it means to be a disciple maker in the church environment, outside the church environment. And I'm just so proud to have you on the podcast today. And thank you so much for your wisdom and encouragement. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeremy.
All right, guys, let's get out there and be disciples that make disciples. Until next time, see ya.